Combat is one of Dune Awakening's most important elements, so people have been very interested to see how it works. Today we're talking all about combat with some of my own footage from the early creator and press beta, which covered roughly the first 20 to 25 hours of gameplay in the early to mid game. In this video we're going to dive into all the nuts and bolts of how combat works and how it feels. Also, quick shameless self-promo, consider checking out my content over on Patreon where you can get videos early, or just join for free to see video previews and progress logs for the upcoming Settlers Season 4. Plug over, let's talk combat. Combat in Dune Awakening is something you're going to do everywhere, from the first few moments to deep into the endgame. It's a cornerstone of the experience, and even if you try to avoid it, though I'm not sure why you would, you'll have to fight at some point. Like death, taxes and sandworms, combat is an inevitability. Knowing that, how does it play out in Dune? Well, the long and short of it is something like this. It feels fairly fluid, requiring both ranged and melee proficiency, with skill trees that adapt and advance your abilities. There is most certainly a bit of a learning curve with a fair amount of nuance. It's not groundbreaking, but it does feel quite nice and smooth and certainly can't be called boring. With that as the brief synopsis, let's dive into the fine details. Basic combat is relatively simple. You can either use melee or range, though you'll need to use both at various points. Ranged combat is basically what you'd expect. There's a few different guns like shotguns, rifles and pistols, obviously effective at various ranges. They're generally not so great against shields, though some weapons like the SMG are designed to overwhelm shields, and based on one of the trailers released a little while ago, it does seem that some weapons could bypass shields. That being said, that weapon was not present in the beta, so I can't confirm. Ranged combat in general does pretty much what you'd expect it to. It does feel quite nice and fluid and fairly intuitive, and if you're familiar with third-person shooters, you'll probably feel right at home with it. Melee combat is where things are a bit different. Whereas ranged is super useful, obviously, at range, melee has its place too. Not only is it the more economic option, but it's also the most effective against shielded foes, and in places where ranged combat isn't as viable. Melee itself is made up of 5 core mechanics: attacking, dodging, staggers, parrying, and stamina. Attacking is quite simple. Each melee weapon I used had a set of nicely flowing light attacks and a slow, high damage, heavy attack designed to pierce shields or just do extra damage. Dodging is of course used to avoid attacks and takes the form of a short dash that's quite easy to use. Staggers are something you want to aim for to open up enemies to these slow but rewarding heavy attacks, but also something you have to watch out for if enemies use certain abilities against you. Parrying is pretty much what you expect. If you block just as an attack hits, you'll parry your enemy, causing them to stagger and opening them up for a guaranteed heavy attack. Enemies can also parry you, though I found it was somewhat uncommon in the early game areas. And finally, stamina is the underpinning of this entire system, though I found it fairly forgiving. Sprinting, jumping, blocking, parrying, and swinging your weapon does not consume stamina, but combat itself will pause stamina regen. Combat in this definition includes, attacking, blocking, and so on. Dodging or using an ability takes up quite a lot of stamina, encouraging careful use of those abilities, else you'll end up out of stamina with your foes bearing down on you. Melee also has a gentle soft lock onto nearby enemies, which feels quite strange at first. You get used to it fairly quickly though. It's nowhere near the same level as like a Dark Souls target lock, it's much more subtle, and I found it did help me keep track of enemies. That being said, it won't force you to face the enemy, so you can turn around and swing at other nearby enemies, parry attacks from people you're not focusing on, and so on. Because it's not a hard target lock, it is also possible to miss attacks on the enemy you're locked onto if you're not careful. I missed a fair few running lunges, so you have to bear in mind that even though you're sort of soft locked onto that target, the game isn't going to guide your strike towards them. For 1v1 fights, the soft lock feels fine, though it might be a little more troublesome for group melee fights. Then again, I made the effort to avoid having to fight more than 2 enemies in melee at once, although sometimes it is unavoidable. On the few occasions in some of the dungeons when I did have to fight 2 or 3 enemies in melee range, and to be fair I was more used to the combat system at this point, I actually didn't have any issues, and there are a few times where I sort of side parried enemies that were trying to come in and attack from a flank. That itself felt really cool. Moving on to armour, Dune offers 3 main varieties: still suits, light armour and heavy armour. Still suits are your sort of general exploration outfit. They help out massively with survival, heat mitigation, and they let you slowly reclaim water from sweat, but it doesn't really do much for combat. Light armour is sort of a happy medium, offering some protection but also a little bit of heat resistance and some stamina concessions. Heavy armour is of course the utmost protection, offering enormous damage reduction but very little protection from the elements and extra stamina cost on top of it. In terms of categories, weapons fall into, of course, melee and ranged. On the melee side, it seems you've got daggers and swords. In the beta, I was able to use kinjals, which are basically daggers, and, of course, swords. The daggers really felt like one-on-one weapons with short range but fast attacks. Swords were definitely a bit more useful against groups, slower but with wide swipes and strikes. On the guns front, I was able to use a Mauler pistol, a Karpov rifle, a shotgun, and an SMG. Does seem like there are other heavier weapons in the later game after looking through the research menu, but I won't really spend too much time on them because, again, I wasn't able to use them. There are also unique schematics for weapons and armour, some of which I did get my hands on in the beta. For example, I found a dagger that automatically drains enemy blood into blood bags, I really like that, and an automatic version of the Mauler pistol. I found a couple of armour pieces too, both of which offered improved stats. I also got my hands on a unique Litterjon, which is a water canteen, and a unique sandbike engine, so it looks like there will be unique tools and vehicle parts too, not just weapons and armour. Unique items themselves are limited crafts, meaning for each time you get that schematic, you are entitled to craft that item once, which incentivises revisiting certain dungeons. You'll also need special metal ingots that you get from dungeons and such, which doubles down on that incentive. Now of course, this being Dune, you'll also have access to a Holtzman shield, if you either loot one in the world or craft it at your base. This is really the great equaliser for combat, meaning you're able to fight enemies with relative safety, even with a still suit on, an armour that would usually offer very little protection. The shield itself draws from your power pack, which is basically a battery you carry to power your equipment. Each hit to the shield drains a little bit of power, but your power pack does regenerate, so unless your shield is quickly overwhelmed, your power pack will restore itself quickly. Of course, enemies can still pierce your shield if they can hit you with a slow heavy attack, and some enemies, like the Gatling gun enemy, definitely do possess enough firepower if you don't deal with them quickly to burn your shield down. Shields are far more suited for melee combat than they are for ranged. If you're firing a weapon with a shield active, your shield will actually drop for a second every time you pull the trigger, presumably so the dart you're firing can actually escape the shield. This will leave you quite open to attacks, especially if you're in the sights of an enemy with a powerful weapon, so shields really are a huge power utility in the hands of melee players. Overall, shields do seem like they'll be very useful in Dune, especially when you want or need to engage in melee combat. That being said, they're not just an easy win tool. They can be overwhelmed, broken or pierced, and they do have vulnerabilities that make them unsuitable for some situations. Also, if you activate a shield in worm territory, that worm is coming. On top of your weapons, armour, shields and so on, you also have abilities and skills from the various skill trees. Dune will have 5 main trees at launch: Trooper, Swordsmaster, Bene Gesserit, Planetologist and Mentat, though it seems you can only unlock Planetologist through gameplay. It's not a starting option, and to be fair, it doesn't really touch combat, it's more of a utility and harvesting skill tree, so instead we'll focus on the other 4. I played Trooper, which offered grenades, grappling hooks and assault hunter seekers. It felt like a very proficient all-round combat class for ranged combat, and offered me a lot of utility in getting enemies out of entrenched positions, opening up fights with explosives and boosting my damage through some of the various skill buffs. I took a good look at Swordsmaster, and you do get to use some of that class's abilities in a story section of the game, no story spoilers though. That tree definitely felt like the melee expert's choice, leaning far harder into swords and daggers with relatively simple abilities that offer surprising utility, and looking through the skill tree itself, that definitely seems the case. Trooper and Swordsmaster seem to be sort of the opposite, both offering to boost either melee or ranged. I didn't try out Bene Gesserit or Mentat myself, but looking through their skill trees they seem quite interesting. The Bene are based around status effects, movement abilities and self-preservation, offering skills to boost small blade damage, unleash fast strikes, manipulate enemy perception and improve their own health and poison resistance. The mentats seem to be based on technology, tactics and stealth, with skills based around deployable turrets and shields, preserving the condition and repair status of armour, applying poison or stuns, and manipulating gravity and enemy perception with technology. They also have some skills based around ranged and ambush combat, perhaps making them suited to sort of a rogue or a stealth role. Each skill also has what seems to be the equivalent of an ultimate ability at the end of each sub-tree, offering a huge burst of power. These abilities all require advanced training, which wasn't available in the beta, and some require a mechanic called Spice Prescience, which is a temporary spice-induced state where your cooldowns are reduced, damage output is increased, and you're also immune to poison, though it also requires you to consume spice to be able to activate it in the first place, and once it has expired it will cause spice withdrawal and increase your spice tolerance after the prescience state is finished. Overall, class abilities will likely be a defining factor in Dune. The devs have said that every player can acquire all of the abilities. This isn't a class-based game. Your initial choice in profession will just give you a starting block advantage, whereas you'll have to learn every other skill by finding the trainer in the world. I think there's going to be some really interesting combinations of different trees and likely a huge number of configurations between PvE and PvP, with some builds better suited for exploration, others for group fights, and some for 1v1 duels. So those are all the major fine details, but how does combat in Dune actually feel? To me, it feels pretty fluid. After a brief period of getting used to the timing, animations, mechanics and so on, I felt quite comfortable with the combat system. In Haga Basin South, the starting area, combat was quite basic, but even in the transition up to the Eastern Vermilius Gap, which is sort of the second biome, the game starts to introduce a lot more variety and challenge. You go from 1v1 or 1v2 at most in Haga Basin South to assaulting camps and labs and old refineries where you might find 10, 15, 20 enemies inside who now are a bit more intelligent. They'll shoot at you from a distance, rush you down with shields, throw grenades, knee strikes, bindu punches, and you'll start to encounter new enemies like the Gatling gun scavenger, who will not only shred your shield with his insane fire rate, but also your health. The beta only went up to Iron tier, and thus I can't really say for certain what lays in the mid to late game, but this step up in challenge is something that I really hope persists. I always rather like when a game introduces you to a new challenge and you learn to adapt to and overcome it, only for the game to then step it up again in the next area. I think there's a lot to be said as well for the cool factor of things. Once you get a grip on the movement and how combat feels, there is definitely a solid cool factor element. Hitting effortless parries or jumping down from a ledge to fight 3 guys at once, again, just feels cool, and I think that really adds a lot to the overall feel of the combat. Now, to be fair, I don't think the combat system is a groundbreaking mechanic. It certainly feels different from a lot of other titles, and there will be an adjustment period for sure, but there's enough space for transferable skills from other titles that I think most will settle into it fairly quickly. Abilities and skills add a lot of flavour to the mix, and though I initially thought that ranged combat would just be the de facto best choice in 99% of cases, I quite often found myself opting for melee more than I thought I would. It definitely helps that melee feels so fluid and has some nice visual and audio feedback. That kind of just hits the dopamine receptors and makes it feel nice, but it is a fairly competent combat option, even more so if you go full swordsmaster, I imagine. That being said, because you can pick up all of the skill trees and be a sort of jack of all trades, I imagine most endgame players will likely end up proficient in all combat methods. For me, I rather enjoyed the combat as a whole, different enough to feel unique without trying to unnecessarily reinvent the wheel. Of course, that's just my feeling on things, and I can't speak for how it will play out in PvP. Feedback on the latter is something that will likely emerge after launch when people get into the deep desert and fight a lot of players. I am historically not a PvP player, so I don't really have the first inkling as to how to assess what's here in the context of PvP. That's something that I think players will again have to give their feedback for when it does launch and people are able to get into those big PvP zones and fight each other over and over again. Ultimately, I really actually enjoyed the combat experience. Obviously that's just my view on it, you'll likely have to give a combat a first-hand go to see how you feel about it. Fortunately, there is the beta weekend coming up for Dune, starting on May 9th, where you can play the same content I've experienced here. I'm currently doing a giveaway of some beta keys in my Discord, so if you'd like the chance to get one and join the beta, join the Discord itself through the link in the description and use the key emoji to react to the message in the giveaways channel to enter. I'll be handing out the keys on May 1st, so not long to go until they're drawn. Anyway, that will about wrap us up for today. Do let me know your thoughts in the comments of what I've shown you, and especially how you feel about Dune's combat just from watching it. Again, I think it feels really nice, but feeling can't necessarily be communicated all too well through a video, but hopefully I've explained it to a decent enough degree that a lot of you get what I'm talking about. Thanks for watching, and a massive thanks to our wonderful esteemed coffee cultists for continuing to support the channel over on Patreon. If you want to support the channel here on YouTube and get some exclusive perks, take a look at the new channel memberships available by clicking join just below this video. Take care, and I'll see you soon.